Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. Socialism. I grew up hearing that word a lot. After all, my father escaped communism when his home country, Croatia, was swallowed up into the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Stories of Croatian life under that oppressive regime were horrific and brutal. But did you ever notice that lately, that word is sometimes being used by politicians and academics in a positive light? The word is even sometimes used to describe Canada, especially since COVID began. If you tune into US political commentary programs, it isn't uncommon to hear Canada being referred to as a bastion of socialism. I recall I once popped into a Bernie Sanders primary campaign office when I was traveling through the US because, yes, I'm a political junkie, so that is something that I do during primary season. Well, when I said I was from Canada, I was greeted with, "Welcome from the great socialist north." Of course, Bernie Sanders himself sees himself as a democratic socialist, so I shouldn't have been too surprised by this. But why do some politicians and university professors praise socialism and communism? We know that over 100 million people died under communism in the 20th century alone. What, if anything, is good about socialism? And if some people think socialism is so wonderful, then why have so many people escaped socialist and communist countries to settle in Canada with no interest in ever returning to that life again? So instead of having a debate on whether Canada is a socialist country, I thought it'd be best to hear from actual Canadians who escaped life under socialist regimes. Well, joining me now to do just that is Colin Craig, president of secondstreet.org, who is compiling stories of survivors of socialism. Colin will walk us through his new project, and we'll also hear from a few survivors themselves, including Marco Navarro-Genie, a survivor from Nicaragua, and Aime Despaigne, a survivor from Cuba. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. We'll hear from Amy in a few moments, but let's start with Colin, and we'll hear from you also, Marco. So, Colin, why are you doing this project?
Well, we thought it'd be interesting to look at this issue further because, of course, as you alluded to, some university professors, politicians, and activists in Canada will talk about socialism being a great thing that Canada should embrace. And of course, we know the track record has led to enormous human suffering, whether it's people being outright killed, dying from famines, living in poverty, whatever it is. The track record of socialism and communism around the world is quite dreadful, but yet it persists. So we thought, well, let's actually talk to people that have come from those countries so that we can get their stories out there, so that young people who are hearing this maybe in class or from politicians can have a resource where they can go and actually hear from people that lived under these regimes. So we thought that would be interesting. And then the other thing we thought would be interesting would be to ask people from socialist and communist countries, are there any policies in Canada that you've observed that remind you of the countries you left, things that maybe Canada shouldn't be doing or we should be backing away from? So we did a survey with a number of people that came from those countries.
Wow. Now, I do know, and I think the figure is 7 million, but I believe it's 7 million Canadians trace their roots to countries that suffered under communism. I believe that's the official figure from Tribute to Liberty Canada. So there are clearly plenty of Canadians who've had some kind of either close or some kind of affiliation within these kinds of experience with living under these kinds of regimes, and it's as you said, it could be quite horrific. So you mentioned this survey you did. So what are Canadian sentiments about socialism?
Well, the number one concern from people who came from socialist and communist countries, Canadians that we surveyed, they said that when they look around Canada, the top concern is that they've seen restrictions on freedom of speech. And the public policy element is a number of people mentioned bills C10 and C36. These are two pieces of legislation that the federal government had before Parliament, before the last election. And those were looking at imposing restrictions on freedom of speech. And the people that we talked to said, no, this is not a good idea. And many mentioned that it goes beyond Parliament, but even just sort of in civil society, we've seen efforts to clamp down on freedom of speech, things like cancel culture and so forth. So it was pretty interesting because we didn't know what to expect when we asked that question.
Yeah, and I do recall several months ago, you mentioned you were going to go down this path of doing this Survivors of Socialism project, and I thought it was a fascinating, excellent idea because there are so many important stories. Well, when we come back from this commercial break, we're going to hear from one such survivor, Marco Navarro-Genie, who's been so patient, and we'll hear from him in just a few moments. Welcome back. We're discussing SecondStreet.org's new series of survivors on socialism, and joining us here is Colin Craig, president of SecondStreet.org, but also a survivor of socialism himself from Nicaragua, Marco Navarro-Genie. Marco, thank you so much for joining us today. And you have a very interesting story to tell. Your family lived under socialist dictatorships. Can you please explain what your family's experience was in Nicaragua?
Nicaraguan families, like most families in Latin America, are very closely knit. So there are ripples of the suffering from the socialist regime of the Sandinistas across all branches of the family. On my immediate family, my father, who was the mayor of a sort of mid-sized town, fourth largest town in Nicaragua, by virtue of the fact that he was the mayor and he had been part of the previous regime, so to speak. He was put in jail. All the goods and the properties that my father owned, some of which he had acquired from his parents, were confiscated or firebombed or completely destroyed. And so that's on the immediate side. And the same thing for my mother's properties. And my father's brother-in-law was in the military. He was the commander of a small garrison in the interior of the country, fairly inconsequential in strategic concerns, and he refused to run. He was an honorable military man, and he decided that he was going to man his garrison and surrender the garrison to the new government. Well, the new government caught up with him, and they again imprisoned them, tortured them, and eventually they pitched him out of a flying helicopter.
They threw him out of a flying helicopter.
Yes, while alive.
Wow.
And we know we don't know where he is, right? So they have for now 40 years refused to tell the family in what part of the jungle they pitched them, because we have no idea.
Well, okay, hold on for a second though. Is Nicaragua, do they still have the socialist government?
That is an excellent question. That government lost an election in the 90s, and for about 14 years they were out of power, and then they returned, essentially using the playbook of the Chavista regime in Venezuela.
Wow.
They started by suppressing the freedom of the press. We were talking about that. The freedom of the press is often the canary in the coal mine. They seized the independent media, and then they started tinkering with the electoral system until the point where they are now. They control absolutely every institution of the state, and they have managed to silence every independent institution in civil society outside of the Catholic Church, and they're already going after the Catholic Church.
Wow. See, this is why it's so important that when there is a regime change for the better, that they pass lustration laws so that it prevents from some of these old criminals, these socialist criminals, from coming back and reviving their old habits, shall we say. So you obviously, your family was deeply affected and impacted by life under a socialist regime. What was it like for, your father's brother-in-law was the head of a little garrison, your father was a mayor. What about for the average Nicaraguan? And I'm not trying to diminish your situation, but for the average peasant, say, for example, in the mountain or something, how was life like for them under socialism?
Also an excellent question. If one should point out that this regime was popular at the beginning. Like many of these regimes tend to be quite populist and making enormous promises. There is at the heart of human beings a desire for justice. And all human societies have a measure of injustice. Nicaragua happened to have a pretty high one at the time. And so it was a popular regime at the beginning, but pretty quickly things changed because those in power began to amass more and more power. Some of these people were guerrillas who had been in the mountains fighting for 10, 15 years. They had no university degrees. They had never held a job. They hadn't had any opportunity to amass any kind of wealth. And within 5 years, they were some of the richest people in the country. And the poor maybe had a little bit more than they had before, but they were still poor. But the stark difference was quite visible. And so basically it was a role reversal. The people who were in power and had some wealth were completely wiped out in a sense. And then the poor people remained poor, and this new sort of elite calling itself Sandinistas, they were in fact some modicum of socialist communists, were the new elite.
Okay, we've got to cut to commercial. Welcome back. We're discussing a fascinating topic. We're discussing survivors of socialism, and this was kind of spawned upon a new, series that secondstreet.org, a research firm, is doing. And here joining me is the president, Colin Craig. Also a survivor of socialism himself is joining us, Marco Navarro-Genie. Marco, before the commercial break, you shared so sadly and eloquently the situation of socialism within Nicaragua, how it was and how horrible it was. Then it kind of had some relief for a few years and then has reverted. Knowing that there is this kind of discussion now happening in Canada where we have people in sort of a fanciful way suggesting that socialism might be a good thing. What words would you have for Canadians who might think that socialism is a good thing? Do you have any advice for them?
Yes, there is a popular expression that says that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. There's nothing wrong with wanting people to have more justice and to have more equitable societies. What I would caution people is that socialism is a poisoned pill, that it begins with a concern for justice and eventually ends up promoting even greater injustice than the injustices that it sought to solve. And that is not just my view. It is the view of every single person who has lived under socialism and of every historian who has studied it.
So how does it feel for you then to know that this is, and this will be my final question, but that there are those who stoke the fire of socialism within Canada, knowing that your family and including yourself fled from something like that?
I used to be an educator. I used to be a university professor. I just read this morning, as a matter of fact, that over 70% of faculty members in North American universities come from the left. That should give you a little bit of an idea. But I happen to think that the single greatest failure of our education system is that the new generation thinks that socialists and communists are worthy of emulating.
Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing your story today. I really appreciate your time. And now joining us to share her experience and her firsthand story is Amy Despain, survivor from the communist Cuba, who now lives in Toronto. Amy, thank you so much for joining us today. So perhaps you start off by telling us, what was your personal experience living in communism in Cuba?
Thank you for having me. Well, I left Cuba early, young. So my experience was as a child there. Living there, there was a lot of repression, especially because I'm Black. There was a lot of saying that anywhere else in the world, we will be discriminated against and we will be slaves. So that's a belief that teachers, everybody has, basically. Maybe now that Cubans have access to the internet, it's a little bit better and they don't believe so much the propaganda. But before, when there was no internet, the teachers will tell me, you are Black and if you leave Cuba, you'll be a slave. And that's what they grow up, every child grow up thinking that because of your skin color or your beliefs, you're less. So the community is very repressive in every single sector, just because the government owns every single sector. So they have the capacity to indoctrinate children, to manipulate the minds of absolutely everybody. and if you don't comply, you will not have a job, you will not have a way to sustain yourself. So it's basically like slavism.
You lived in slavery in a sense. So knowing, so how did your parents cope with that? I mean, they're sending their young daughter to school knowing that she's going to be indoctrinated. They had no choice, really, if they lived in Cuba, am I right?
No choices. In Cuba, there's no such thing as private education, no private anything. So if you're a child, if you're a parent and you don't want to, your children to go to school, you will have to send them to a different country or take them with you. So there's really no choice.
And that's only if you could escape, because most people can't get out of Cuba. Right.
Exactly. So in school, it was basically like, is that, or they call you a gusano, like a worm, and they call you like, it's a very like hard situation to live in. So some parents opt to leave, or some parents just like live in hypocrisy basically and allow it.
Wow. And I mean, clearly it sounds like you're being taught racism. You're being treated in a very racist way. So I can only imagine how difficult that was as a child trying to navigate the world, learning your numbers and math and all those things, and then having to deal with the indoctrination on top of that. It must have been very shocking for your parents, but also very hard for you as a young daughter. Welcome back. We're discussing how one survives socialism, if at all, and we're going to deal with that by discussing or speaking with a survivor of socialism herself, Aime Despaigne. Amy, again, you grew up in communist Cuba. You left when you were young. Your parents had to make some hard decisions. You mentioned that that there would be consequences if you spoke out. Did anybody in your family ever speak out, or any of your friends? And if so, what would the response be, or what was it from the government?
My family didn't, but I do have friends that are now in prison. My friend Luis Mario Nidas Hernandez, he's in prison now. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He was one of the protesters of the past July 11th.
Yes.
There was a huge uprising in Cuba, and he was there. And he was sentenced to 3 years in prison, but there's also children that are in prison now and are like sentenced to like 30, 25 years in prison for protesting, or for only saying, I want freedom and I just want to express myself.
So even children are in prison because they're saying
13,
they want
14,
freedom.
All that information is available. And it is a really harsh situation right now. And there's over 1,000 political prisoners in Cuba right now.
So what do you say then when you hear Canadians, championing or encouraging more socialism in Canada, or some socialism in Canada, saying that this is a good thing, we should do this? What is your response to them?
It is hard to keep my cool sometimes when I hear that, because I know firsthand how repressive it is to live in a society where you cannot speak, where you cannot live your life, where even the food you eat is rationed. So like I try to explain the details of how you live, because sometimes you generalize and people don't understand. So I try to explain like the details, like how they force children to like vaccinate without parent consent, how like even parents don't have any rights over their children or over anything. And maybe they'll maybe they'll understand a little bit more from that perspective than if I generalize. So I try to like explain it from like a personal experience and like details of how you live really, and the hunger.
So thank you for that. So Colin, hearing what Amy said and previously what Marco's experience has been, what do you hope to achieve with this project, with the Survivors of Socialism project?
Well, I hope more people hear the full story, because I don't think people always hear the full story when it comes to this topic, especially in universities where you have professors that tell you half the story and they glorify these regimes without ever having actually lived in them themselves. You talk to people that come from communist and socialist countries and it's the same story over and over again. Don't do it. That was one of the big points from our survey when we asked people, what is your advice to a young person who's maybe thinking that socialism or communism is a good idea? people that came from those countries overwhelmingly said, don't do it. It's not what it's cracked up to be. And
But
so I think
a lot of times I find that, when immigrants come and they escape a totalitarian regime, a socialist regime, a communist regime, they come here and they're literally rebuilding their life from scratch. They usually don't enter into as a tenured professor, or they're not, being lawyers and judges and doctors as they were in their previous country. So if the persons in this country who control the levers of power, who wield the largest influence, are those in academia, the judges, the lawyers, the doctors, and they're not reflective of those who've survived socialism, is there hope that this message would carry through?
I think the hope lies in the very real fact that Canada, as you alluded to earlier, Tanya, Canada has so many people that have come from all over the world, including socialist and communist countries. It's a ripe opportunity for young people. If they want to know the truth, it's not hard to find someone who came directly from one of those countries or who has relatives. Just go and talk to them. Talk to someone whose relatives came from Ukraine or Cuba or China, wherever the country is. I mean, there's a lot of opportunities for young people to learn. Our website is going to have more and more videos every month with people that came from these countries, so people can hear these stories directly from people who have lived there, not people in ivory towers who fantasize about structures of government that clearly do not work.
Okay, well, on that note, we'll leave it there. Thank you both so very much, and best wishes to your project. Again, secondstreet.org if you want to learn some more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Survivors of Socialism, what a fantastic idea for our project. I think always hearing a first-hand account of someone who, again, lived under that kind of oppression is important because it helps keep things in perspective. It's easy for us to say, oh, this sounds great or that sounds great, but when you hear the stories of people who actually lived under that and the truth, then I think it really brings everything back into perspective. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.